All right, you're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson. Today I'll be speaking with Father Stephen M. Koeth about his recent book, Crabgrass Catholicism: How Suburbanization Transformed Faith and Politics in Postwar America. Stephen is a history professor at the University of Notre Dame and an ordained priest in the Congregation of the Holy Cross. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to get started, kind of to set the scene for us, something I think I don't have a ton of context for and I'm interested in because I think it plays a key role is where did the suburbs even come from? Is that a relatively new idea that we have this kind of community? Is that a uniquely American thing, or has this been around in some form or another for a long time?
There's no doubt that even given the derivation of the word, that we've had people living on the outskirts of cities as long as there's been cities. And so outside of Athens or Rome or Jerusalem, you would have had suburbs outside of the city. In the American context, I think some of the first cities, the first suburbs, emerge even in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, around Boston and New York and Philadelphia, right? But the modern suburbs, the suburbs that I'm talking about, and the suburbs I think that most Americans today think of when they hear the word suburb, really emerge after 1945, after World War II, and they're premised on highways. The American suburbs of the previous era would have been premised on rail lines, and they're often referred to as streetcar suburbs. But the neighborhoods that were streetcar suburbs today are parts of cities, or are more urban by their layout and by their feel, by the density, etc. What we think of today as suburbs, single-family houses, detached, lower density, and premised on the automobile as the principal form of transportation. Those really do emerge after World War II. And though they exist in other parts of the world, there's no doubt that America is the quintessentially suburban nation. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and you say, the American suburbs have this distinct culture. You think of soccer moms and backyard barbecues and carpooling and things like that. Where did that culture come from, and how did um, the Catholic parish play a role in shaping that culture into what it is today?
Yeah, I think that the idea of the suburb is the idea of the good life. It's the idea of fleeing the city with its dirt, its crime, its dirty air, its density, its lack of places for kids to play. And the idea of the suburbs is get your own piece of the good life. First of all, you're not renting, you're owning. You have your own castle, you have your white picket fence, front lawn, and backyard. It's a safe place for kids to play. There are excellent schools. It's separated from work, so it's focused on the family and it's focused on leisure. And of course, it emerges in this post-war period where the post-war economy is also booming, and it's a consumerist economy, an economy that had been premised during the war on building tanks and jeeps and ammunitions and planes. And now is building refrigerators and hi-fi stereo systems and television sets. And the suburban house becomes that place where you accumulate the things that make for a good life in this consumerist idea. Um, Catholics participate in this move to the suburbs after World War II at high rates. This is the first time in American life where Catholics are achieving the levels of education and the levels of income that would allow them to suburbanize. And after World War II, there's a housing crisis. There's not enough housing in the urban core. 13 or 15 years of depression and World War II, a lack of building of new housing units, a lack of maintenance of old housing units, and then these GIs coming back from the war, getting married, settling down. There's not enough housing. The solution could have been public housing, and that was one thing that was tried and included in the Housing Acts of that era. But it's really suburbanization that answers that problem. It's Levitt and Levittown and these suburban developments, and it's precisely at this moment that these Catholic GIs on the GI Bill, going off to college, attaining better jobs and better levels of income, they are able to move to the suburbs. And so the Catholics make up a significant portion of the suburbanizing population of the United States at that era. And the church provides an infrastructure for that suburbanization. Um, Catholic institutions, including the Catholic War Veterans of America and parishes, are pushing suburbanization as they advertise for suburban housing developments,
Mm.
including mention of, oh, very nearby this particular parish or very nearby this particular school. They build model homes and raffle off tickets to visit the model home, have a dream house, and then at the end, somebody winning ticket actually wins the house, right? So Catholic institutions are propelling people to think about and want to suburbanize. They're helping build suburban neighborhoods by building parishes and schools and hospitals and other institutions. But all along, there's also this worry by a lot of Catholic pastoral figures, this consumerism of the suburbs, this focus on the stuff that goes into the suburban house. How's that going to fit? How's that going to match with a Christian idea of poverty or of self-abnegation, right? Are you going to be focused just on accruing more and more money and more stuff, right? So Andrew Greeley, a Catholic priest and sociologist, who writes a lot about suburbanization at this time, this is one of his great concerns: is Catholics are helping build the post-war suburbs. They're creating that infrastructure. They're creating this ideal that you're discussing of backyard barbecues and mom and dad and two kids and a car in the garage. But how is their participation in the life of faith being changed by this and the way that their values, etc.?
Mm. Yeah, no, there's a lot to get into there, and I plan to throughout this, and
Yeah.
I also want to, as another way of just kind of setting the scene, I'm curious why you decided, this is something that's happening all over the country, massive effort, but you really hold in on New York and really specifically on Long Island.
Yes.
And why did that feel like the right place, the microcosm that you wanted to focus on to tell the bigger story of what was happening with Catholicism in the suburbs?
Yeah, I began this project as a graduate student at Columbia University, and so the nearness of the sources was certainly a part of it. But in 1957, the Vatican establishes a new diocese on Long Island. Prior to 1957, all of the Catholics on Long Island, Brooklyn and Queens, the western end of Long Island, which are the two boroughs, two of the five boroughs of New York City, and Nassau and Suffolk County, the two eastern counties of the island. All four counties are covered by the Diocese of Brooklyn. And in 1957, the Vatican says we're going to create a new diocese in Rockville Center in Nassau County, and it is going to administer the church in Nassau and Suffolk counties, leaving the Diocese of Brooklyn with just two counties, both of them urban, part of New York City. And Catholics all over the United States look at this and see, the Vatican is recognizing that we're in the suburban moment, and that the future of the church in this country is suburban. And here's this diocese that it doesn't have a major metropolis. It's not Boston or St. Louis or Detroit or Chicago. It is entirely suburban. So let's watch this diocese. How is it developing? How is it founding parishes? How is it running schools, et cetera, et cetera? We better pay attention because that's happening outside of cities all over the country, and it really is the future. So the Diocese of Rockville Center it wasn't just that it was convenient for my research in New York, but it really was because, and Levittown, of course, the quintessential American suburb, right? In a lot of ways, the kind of beau ideal in that era, the first example. So Nassau and Suffolk County, the Diocese of Rockville Center, Levittown, really does encapsulate a suburbanizing story that's happening all over the country in the 50s and 60s. So I do think it really is the ideal place to start an examination of suburbanization and Catholicism.
Totally. No, I think that makes a ton of sense, and I figured that's about why. I think another thing that I thought was kind of interesting is that it was clearly kind of a time, you know, the big conflict was over. We're kind of reorganizing society. We're having kids. There's a lot of experimentation happening, and there's reorganization of things, and you talk about some of the strange ways that they were trying things. I think of particularly you mentioned there was a church that would hold their mass at a drive-in movie theater
Mm.
for years and years. And I'm curious what other experiments were going on? What other things were people trying as they shifted into this new way of living life?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wanted to try to capture the excitement, the optimism, the future-oriented thinking of the era. I didn't want to just be looking from 2025 and say, "Ooh, the numbers of nuns went down, the number of priests went down." Uh, yes, we know that that's true, but I wanted to try to capture the fact that in 1952, that's not necessarily what people were feeling. They were feeling the excitement, as you say, of having successfully defeated fascism, won the World War, the peace is won. Um, Even optimism around the fact we've harnessed the power of the atom. We're in the atomic future, right? And there's all sorts of excitement about those big cultural events, and also the excitement of I have a new home.
Mm,
I finally own my own home, and we've established our own parish, and it's our parish. It's not just Father McGillicuddy's parish, right? It's ours because we turned what had been a chicken coop at a farm into where we have mass because the suburb grew so quickly we needed some place to have
mm,
mass. And the fact that I hammered the nails and my wife sewed the curtains and somebody painted it would give this sense of ownership and excitement. And that plays itself out over these years of suburbanizing. I use the phrase kind of pioneering, right?
mm,
And I borrow that phrase from interviews at the time and subsequently that they felt that they were pioneers. It was exciting. It was challenging, yes. They sometimes felt like they were gypsies. The school hadn't been built yet. The church hadn't been built yet. We had to find where we could go. But it was exciting and it was novel, right? You pointed out what is perhaps the most kind of interesting and illuminating example of this kind of experimentation at this time, based on necessity. St. Anne's Parish in Brentwood expands significantly in the 1950s, and the original church is a small rural church. Where are we going to have all of these people come for Sunday Mass? That's the first question that a parish has to ask. Some places answer that question by borrowing an airplane hangar or
mm,
a VFW post or a firehouse. In some instances, a public school building when that
mm,
was allowed. Um, but St. Anne's Parish says on Sunday morning when there's perfect sunshine, nobody is using the drive-in movie theater because it needs
mm,
to be dark. So let's talk to the drive-in movie theater owner and rent it, and we can have mass there. People can pull up in their cars. There's speakers. There's a focal point. They're all focused towards the screen. And they did that one summer and thought that would be it. But it ended up being 13 years that they ended up using that drive-in movie theater, right? And in fact, they end up buying the theater and owning it, right? Um, it wasn't a long-term solution, even though it lasted 13 years. It wasn't something that anybody necessarily thought was a great way to go to mass, right? A great way to build community. But necessity, the mother of invention. There are other things, perhaps less kind of emblematic and less exciting to hear about. But to have religious instruction in people's homes, that was novel and unusual. It was always in the Catholic school. It was always taught by Catholic nuns. Well, now there is no Catholic school in a brand newly built suburb, and there are no nuns assigned to the parish yet. And so not only is the religious education classes being held in people's living rooms and basements, it's being led by lay people. The parents, the fathers and mothers are the ones doing the instruction. This too is novel and experimental. That ends up lasting much longer to this very day. There's not enough nuns, and so lay people do that kind of catechesis. But at this era, that in the 1950s, this was unbelievably novel and experimental. And I think that there's other examples, and I go in the book go into numerous of them in very different categories in methods of education and passing on the faith. There's novelty and there's experimentation in the liturgy, the mass, where the mass is held in the church building or in someone's home, the role that the laity have in the mass. Do the laity do the readings? Do the laity assist in the distribution of communion? All
mm,
of these things are novel and experimental because of suburbanization and also because of the parallel between the time of suburbanization and the Second Vatican Council and the reforms of the 1960s. All of these things come together. But yes, definitely an era of excitement, of novelty, of experimentation. And I try to capture that excitement and not just kind of jump to some of the decline that we know comes at later periods in terms of the number of vocations or the number of kids in Catholic schools, etc.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I think like something else I've been wanting to understand is before we get to today, and yeah, how I suppose religiously apathetic a lot of the American suburbs are. Um, there is this great joy and excitement that you see in this church that kind of reminds you of the early church and some of the last letters of the New Testament and things like that, where people are just happy to be speaking and sharing the gospel everywhere they can. Um, and I love that, and I'm also wondering how did, before it got to where we are today, how did Catholic families suffer or find new challenges because of the severe speed at which these parishes were established? That was like, I believe that was severely abnormal how fast they kind of were springing these up, trying to make them functional. What were the challenges? How did that kind of set people up for things that maybe they weren't quite ready for, and what were kind of those sorts of negative effects even at the beginning?
Yeah, again, you're absolutely right. There was absolute excitement at the chance to pioneer a new parish, but there were lots of challenges. These suburbs grew exceedingly rapidly. There's lots of parallels between the way that suburban parishes in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s are established by the diocese to the way that they had been previously. In some instances, it's because the bishop recognizes, development is starting to move out this direction. We might want to start to buy a piece of property and plan for a parish, and that did happen prior to suburbanization and after. So too, the laity would come forward and say, Bishop, we live so far from the parish that we're assigned to, and transportation is difficult. We could really use a priest in this town and have a church here, and that's how a church would be. And so there's parallels that way that a parish would be established existed prior to suburbanization and was true during suburbanization. So there are some similarities. The difference is the speed, I think. I mean, you have Levittown, for example, you have potato farms where one year it's potato farms and within 12 to 18 months it's 2,000 families, right? So all of a sudden we need a church immediately for Sunday Mass. And then quickly after that, we need someplace for kids to go to catechesis. And we'll deal with the rest of what a parish has and space for it down the line. But immediately, let's answer that question of where is Mass being held, right? And so that leads to that experimentation that we just referred to, right? But the challenge is space and personnel right away, and then even as then it's fundraising. Though that's a challenge that, to be quite frank, the laity in the post-war suburbs rises to very easily, seemingly. Obviously, there's sacrifice involved. There's money that's being put aside to donate to the church, on top of the mortgage you're paying for your suburban house and the suburban taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So there is sacrifice there. But so many of these parishes, so many of these dioceses establish funding drives to build a new church, to build a new school, and they exceed their goals very rapidly, meet or exceed their goals. So, although that is a challenge, you asked about what challenges are these people facing. It is a challenge. They meet it, right? And they raise an unbelievable amount of money to build an unbelievable amount of schools, rectories, convents, hospitals, high schools, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's just so not only the speed, but the sheer size, the number of families that are assigned to or within the bounds of a particular parish. Even after we build this church, we're no longer in the drive-in. We're no longer at the VFW post. We've got our own church. We've got our own school. But now the challenge is there's so many people coming to Mass on Sunday that we have 6 or 7 Sunday morning Masses. And so the parking lot has to turn over quickly, right? So from the very beginning, there's complaints about not knowing other parishioners as well as they want to, not knowing the priest doesn't know me as well as I would want him to, or I don't know him as well. And again, with the size, there's some answer of like, well, how could we? There's just so many, and the turnover after mass. The fact that Sunday and Sunday morning mass is the principal or maybe even only point of contact is also a change, right? In the urban context, maybe you walk past the church 3 or 4 times a day, going to the store and going to the subway and going to work. Maybe there's more interaction with parishioners and more interaction with the priests and the sisters. Um, the number of people in the parish and the number of children, especially, this is the baby boom after all, leads to another challenge with Catholic education. Okay, we built the school. We built 3 classrooms on a grade level. That's a big Catholic school. We're putting 50 kids in each classroom. So that's 150 kids on a grade level. But in a given year, we're baptizing 400 or 500 babies. 5 years later, when they come to go to kindergarten, you now have 400 or 500 kindergarteners and only space for 150 of them. So that's another huge challenge that the suburbs face. Um, yeah, so I would say the speed and the size, even more so than the money,
Yeah.
although that's there too. Those are all challenges, and then the way that those all knock on to the challenge of forming community and whether or not the parish is something other than a fueling station. The language is used even before suburbanization, but especially in the 50s and 60s. There's this fear: is the parish simply a place that I drive up 1 hour a week on a Sunday morning, fill up on grace, like I fill up my car with gas, and then pull away, and that's it. And I'll come back 7 days later for the next fill up. In suburban parishes that are this big with this many parishioners, there is an increasing concern that that's all the parish is.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean you brought up education there, and you give a lot of the book to education and the establishment of schools. So I want to make sure I give some time here for you to talk about it. Um, Talk about how these parishes went about establishing their own schools and how they face some of these challenges of having too many kids. But if you would start with what were the initial qualms that most Catholic families would have had with the public schools in the area? What were the concerns? Why did they feel the need to have their own schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think all through American history, the American Catholic bishops have pushed for parishes to have Catholic schools and for Catholic children to receive their education in Catholic schools, and that's a fear that in a public school, especially in an earlier era, they would have been Protestantized. They were made to read the Protestant Bible. They weren't allowed to read the Catholic Bible. So fine, we're just going to create our own school system, and that we're going to protect our kids from proselytization that way. Um, and then in the post-war period, in the period of suburbanization, that's still, in a certain sense, that still remains the reason why parents want a separate education. It's not that the public schools are not teaching math well enough or science or whatever else. It's that, and I have interviews with parishioners who are lined up at their parish to sign up their kids for the limited number of seats that there are in the Catholic school. Why are you enrolling your kid here as opposed to the public school? Well, because I want moral values and I want religion and I want faith and I want our Catholic culture to be a part of my child's every day in school. And so there's unbelievable demand on the part of Catholic parents in this era of suburbanization and baby boom for Catholic schools. A story of Father John Leonard at Our Lady of Grace Parish in West Babylon, New York. The parish is established, but there's no buildings yet. There's no school or church. He's living in a temporary rectory, a suburban house that's been rented for that purpose. And he says he tells the story he tells is that the first night he stayed in that temporary rectory, there was a knock on the front door, and there was a woman who was a parishioner who asked, "Father, when are you going to build the school?" Right? That the rhetoric and the memory of American Catholics is such that the education was so important, Catholic schooling was so important that many parishes built the school first and maybe even had Sunday Mass in the school gym or the cafeteria and built the church 3 or 5 or 7 years later when they had the money. That's how much Catholic parents valued the idea of Catholic education, and they wanted it for that moral and religious and faith-based education. What I find is that as much as that's the rhetoric that, oh, build the school first and then the church, and as much as that was even diocesan policy, the Diocese of Brooklyn, which controls Nassau and Suffolk County until 1957, in the late 40s and early 50s, diocesan policy is you are supposed to build the school first and then build the church later. In the breach, that doesn't always happen. In many parishes, I find they don't build the school until 5 or 6 or 7 years after they've established the parish and built the church. But still, Catholic education is that important, that desired by parents.
Mm. Yeah. The other thing that I think was another kind of big joyful point of the book that I hadn't ever considered before is the way the suburbanization of the Catholic Church broke down the ethnic barriers, where it was so much less important now to be Irish Catholic, Italian Catholic, whatever hyphenate
Yep.
Catholic you were. How did that happen, and how did that impact and change the structure of most parishes?
That was beginning to happen in the era before post-war suburbanization, even before World War II, as American Catholicism got further and further from the immediate immigrant experience. We're now one generation or two generations past immigration. That was already beginning to happen. Ethnicity was less important, but people still lived in urban centers where the parishes were ethnically inflected. This is the German parish, the Polish parish, the Italian parish. So even if in the second or third generation I don't speak Italian anymore, the church is still has a name that is dedicated, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, or is something that's noticeably Italian or noticeably Polish. And the priest and the nuns at that parish and school are noticeably ethnically Polish or Italian. And the festivals, the feast days, the saints that are celebrated are noticeably Italian or Polish or German. And then when suburbanization happens, it really is it's a final breaking point. Um, the parishes that are established, look at the names of them. First of all, it's the easiest thing to do. There's not Saint Stanislaus Kostka Parish being founded, right? A clearly Polish name. There's Saint Peter and Saint Paul. There's Our Lady of Grace. They're more generically Catholic names, in part because these parishes were meant to be American, right? They were meant to be a mix of Italian and Irish and Polish. And if you look not only at the name, but if you look at the schedule of liturgies or the schedule of feast days, look at the statuary or iconography in the church. All of it is less ethnically inflected, and we're well past a time where masses or homilies are going to be given in a language other than English, right?
Mhm.
And so ethnicity does diminish. There's no two ways about that in importance. It probably privatizes. It's not that it goes away entirely. Italian Catholics on Long Island in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even today, are going to grandma's house on Sunday afternoon for sauce, right? And they may have an image of an Italian saint or whatever else in the home. But again, it's privatized. The parish is not inflected ethnically the way that it once was. That's for some, that's a celebration point, right? A lot of Catholic commentators saw the ethnic inflection of urban parishes and national parishes, as they were called, saw it as divisive. We should all be together as Catholics. We shouldn't be divided by ethnicity. So the move to the suburbs and this amalgamation would be celebrated. For others, it's a loss. It's a loss of ethnic heritage and of ethnic culture.
Mhm.
Uh, and I would argue it's also a loss of a means by which faith is passed on to the next generation. That faith and culture together with the foods that you eat and the feast days that you celebrate and the music that you sing and the dress that you wear, all of those things help pass faith and culture from one generation to the next. And as that diminished in the post-immigration period and as it was really kind of wiped away in suburban parishes, it becomes harder to pass the faith on to the next generation. Hence, the increasing importance of the school. I think the Catholic parish grade school is probably more important to American Catholics in 1950 or 52 or 55 or 62 than it was even in 1890 or 1910 or 1920. Part of that's the baby boom, but I think part of that is the parish school is carrying even more of the weight of having to pass the faith on because ethnicity wasn't able to contribute to that.
Mm.
The parallel that I also go into in the book is ethnicity might have diminished, but race kind of increases in importance
Mm.
in a certain sense. And I'm far from the first scholar to talk about this. I'm relying on any number of scholars of immigration and of ethnicity and of race who say that um, ethnic European immigrants over time become white, right? When they first arrive in the United
Mm.
States, the Irish aren't deemed to be white. When they first arrive in the United States, the Italians aren't deemed to be white. But part of how they become white is by kind of diminishing that ethnic inflection and that ethnic difference and kind of latching on to racial identity. And of course, we're talking in the 1950s and 1960s, the height of the civil rights movement. And so a
Mm.
racial bifurcation becomes more salient than the ethnic bifurcations that had previously existed. So I go into that as well in the book.
Mm. Yeah, no, I appreciate you clarifying. It's one of those things where on the surface that seems like really simple. Oh, we're all getting along, but
Right.
if it's just to create a way that, the whites can all stand together and keep other people out, obviously that's super concerning. Yeah, I appreciate you breaking that down for me.
And of course, the suburbs themselves were premised on
Mm.
racial bifurcation, right? I mean, the GI Bill and FHA loans, et cetera, were available to white veterans and to white suburbanites, not available to black residents. So Long Island, even today, is one of the more segregated areas of the country, residentially segregated. And so uh, the dire kind of premise of the suburbs, there's a racial connotation to it.
Mm. Yeah, right. Yeah, so we're about out of time, and that's okay because we've covered most of what I wanted to talk about. But I'll just let you end with this question. You mentioned it earlier, and it's definitely in the book. You talk about how when suburbs were advertised and marketed, a lot of times they were advertised around, hey, here's this church you can go join. Faith, religious life was at the center of the suburban experience. Obviously, that's nowhere near what it's like today. If anything, there might be a nominal religiosity to the suburbs. I would love for you to pinpoint for me what exactly changed in the American suburbs to go from religion at the center to now very apathetic towards it.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that the suburbs are apathetic about religion. I do think you find like the proliferation of megachurches, the megachurch phenomenon of the
Sure.
1970s, 80s into the 90s. Evangelicalism thrives in American suburbs across the country. So I do think that there is still a religious importance in the suburbs. But I do think that you're right that there's not a centrality the way that it once was, especially even to the planning and to the layout and to the infrastructure of suburban life. In a previous era, yes, the church, the Catholic Church in particular, was buying land in anticipation of development and expansion, and the housing developers were advertising their developments. Buy a house in my development because my development is right near St. Patrick's Parish, and you're going to want to be able to walk there or send your kids to that school. So yeah, a centrality then that probably isn't quite true now. I mean, I do think that, and I go into this a little bit. Um, I think, in a certain sense, the seeds of the religious disaffiliation that we see today, the diminished importance of the church today or religion today, the seeds of that were sown in this era of suburbanization. In part because, going back to our previous part of our conversation, religion becomes yet one more thing that people can either choose to buy or not choose to buy. It goes back to
Mm.
this point that Andrew Greeley first brought up in the 1950s of does religion just become a consumer item? And people can choose to buy it or not, just as they choose to buy which refrigerator or which TV or which car. I do think that that is a big piece of the change in religious practice from the height of the 1950s, which was a particularly religiously involved era, we have to admit, to a diminished importance of religion. I think another factor, again, kind of the seed that's sown at this time, is an individualization of religion, especially from the Catholic point of view. Um, I narrate a kind of move from the streets of the parish and the parish church, which is communal, to individual, to the or privatization, to the family home. And I narrate that as having, as occurring through things like novenas and rosaries, which were communal in the church, in the streets, and are now in the home and are private, or retreats, which were held at retreat centers and were done communally. And now, oh, here's a book you can use in your own home and do your own personal retreat, or even watch the television set, and we're going to do a
Mm,
televised retreat. So I think this kind of consumerist angle, and I think this also kind of privatization and individualization angle, I think these things kind of come together in such a way that increasingly people feel religion isn't something that is part of my identity from the core, and I don't have a choice about that. I'm just born into this, and this is who I am, and I'm Irish and a Catholic, and at this era, it becomes something that has to be chosen. It has to
mm,
be, and I can choose not to. And the
mm,
ramifications of my choosing not to embrace it aren't especially steep. I'm not going to be ostracized from my family. I'm not going to be kicked out of the neighborhood. I'm not going to be able to not find a spouse. There's not a particularly high penalty point for not choosing religion. I think all these things kind of come in this era of the 1950s and 1960s, and in part through suburbanization and the cultural change that brings about, that then explains the 80s, 90s, and today, and some of the kind of disaffiliation or diminished importance of religion that you ask about.
mm. Yeah, no, well, very well said. Everybody, that is Stephen M. Koeth. His book is Crabgrass Catholicism. You can find that link in the description. Stephen, thank you so, so much for being on the
My
show. We
pleasure.
really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matthew.